The committee will come to order. Mr. Kearns will, after opening statements from me and from the ranking member, Mr. Camp, will give an explanation, detailed but brief. I understand your mother and your wife are here, not the 4 children. Or 3 children? 3 children. Good morning. So we come to order for the purpose of considering an amendment to this Bill 2378 in the nature of a substitute. This committee, with its long history, is charged with establishing U.S. trade policy. We all take this very, very seriously. And I think we all know that our relationship with China is an important aspect of our trade relationship. And we come here today at this moment, and I think an important one, after years of deliberation and discussion in various venues. And we're here today to address one of the serious critical issues in our trade relationship with China, its exchange rate policy. Our hearings last week, I think, brought out these facts. Number one, its persistent manipulation is a major distortion in the international marketplace. China has now accumulated $2.4 trillion in reserves, the highest in the history. And I was checking the deficit figures for last year once again. We exported $70 billion. They imported $296 billion, a huge trade deficit of $227 billion with China. The second fact that came out in the hearing, in the 2 hearings, was that this has a major impact on American businesses and American workers, and therefore American jobs. That's what this is really all about. A third fact that came out was that efforts to date haven't worked to address this persistent imbalance. And a fourth factor that came out very vividly at our hearings last week was that additional measures are necessary. So that's why we're here today, to exercise the responsibilities of this committee. So the legislation before us today clarifies that countervailing duties can be imposed to offset the effects of an undervalued currency. Countervailing duties would be available to any U.S. industry, and I emphasize that could demonstrate that it has been materially injured, that's a requirement, by imports from the country with the undervalued currency. And by doing so, this bill will help to provide meaningful relief to those who are harmed by China's persistent exchange policy. Now, we took the original bill, and as Mr. Camp and I discussed, there was work done over last weekend and into early this week to make changes to be sure that it was WTO consistent. And I'm confident that this bill is fully consistent with WTO rules. WTO rules allow the application of countervailing duties to offset or neutralize export subsidies. And to date, Commerce has not utilized its authority to address this. And this bill essentially provides a structure which will bring that about. Very importantly, I want to emphasize this. The bill, as we amended it, preserves Commerce's authority and responsibility to consider each case on its own facts, and to make a determination as to whether all the necessary legal elements of an export subsidy are met. Just a brief word about the argument about retaliation. Any retaliation by itself would be inconsistent with the rules of the WTO. WTO inconsistent retaliation is not a reason to delay pursuit of WTO consistent action. So here we are with a bill that is consistent with our obligations and most importantly meets the committee's obligation to look after in a responsible way the needs of American businesses and of American workers. So the bill builds off the original legislation, which had 109 sponsors. It carefully brings about compliance on a bipartisan basis. It brings about our compliance with our international obligations. It provides enough flexibility in the implementation and enforcement of the bill and gives the administration, and I emphasize this, further impetus to pursue the issue in the international community. I close by reminding us what was said at the outset of this hearing. The status quo is unacceptable and unsustainable. And this legislation is a responsible and necessary step toward addressing the persistent imbalance created by China's undervalued currency and its impact on American businesses and American workers. Therefore, this is a jobs bill. It's now my privilege to yield to the ranking member, Mr. Camp.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. At the 4 hearings we held this year on China, we heard from many experts about our economic relationship with China, and in particular, China's currency policy. There's no debate that China's currency is fundamentally misaligned, and we all agree that China must take prompt action to allow market forces to determine the value of its currency. But let's not kid ourselves. There are far larger issues with regard to China and our trade imbalance. The majority has missed an opportunity to address issues like intellectual property rights, indigenous innovation, and a host of other non-tariff barriers that are wreaking havoc on American employers, their workers, and our economy. Yet here we are, 4 years into their majority and just over 5 weeks until an election, and the sum of this committee's action on trade is a bill dealing only with currency. That's more than disappointing. Despite my disappointment about the broader trade agenda, or a lack of one, the bill before us does deserve consideration. In the past, I expressed serious concern with a number of legislative proposals, including the original version of H.R. 2378 that could potentially expose the United States to WTO-sanctioned retaliation and undoubtedly do more harm than good. In fact, Mr. Brady and I sent a letter to Ambassador Kirk asking him about whether such an approach would be WTO consistent, and we've not received an answer. At the same time, I've always said, as I did last week, that it would be an enormous mistake to give up completely on addressing China's currency policy. The substitute we're considering today is substantially modified and addresses some of the concerns I and many others have expressed. I appreciate that the Chairman has taken into account the many issues that several witnesses and Republican members raised at our 4 hearings in drafting this legislation. Rather than tinker at the margin, the Chairman has completely thrown out the troublesome original version of H.R. 2378. The measure no longer mandates that the Department of Commerce automatically adjust anti-dumping and countervailing duty calculations to account for China's currency policy. Rather, it removes the anti-dumping portion entirely and leaves the countervailing duty decision entirely in the discretion of the Department of Commerce as under current law. The substitute allows Commerce to consider many factors in determining whether or not China's currency policy satisfies the technical definition of an export subsidy. It does not presuppose an outcome. The substitute does not redefine financial contribution, one of the 3 countervailing duty tests, so Commerce will continue to analyze this issue based on current law. These are critical changes from the original bill, which on its face violated our WTO obligations. And while I remain deeply concerned about using the countervailing duty law to address China's currency policy, I believe enacting this substitute does not result in an automatic violation of our WTO obligations. It does send a clear signal to China that Congress's patience is running out without giving China an excuse to take it out on U.S. companies and their workers. It also sends an important signal to this administration. Congress has heard enough. It's time to produce results. The administration must step up its efforts to work with Europe, Japan, Brazil, India, and other Asian countries and set a clear timeline for action. The first step is to put the issue of global imbalances, which naturally includes China currency policy, on the agenda at the November G20 meetings in Seoul as a prominent item. I'm disturbed to see the Korean finance minister was quoted yesterday as saying that a country's individual currency policy is not an appropriate topic for the G20. The administration needs to change this dynamic. Let me emphasize, the fact that the administration has not moved aggressively on a multilateral basis, combined with the need by some to put politics above job creation right before the election, are the reasons we're here today, considering legislation that is better than the original, but still won't resolve our trade imbalance with China. While I will vote in support of this substitute, I'm also deeply concerned that this is the only markup of a trade bill we've had in this entire Congress. While this legislation addresses an important issue, it will not advance the goal of doubling exports in 5 years. We must move expeditiously on the pending free trade agreements, work harder to open new markets to our exports, and address our broader economic issues all over the world and with China. And with that, I yield back.
Mr. Camp, thank you. I welcome your support, though not all of your reasoning.
Mr. Chairman.
And let me just say, just briefly, so we can get on with the bill. I know, Mr. Rangel, you just a minute. The administration, the President, as we know, raised this at the last G20 meeting to his credit. The Chinese promised flexibility. It hasn't delivered. And to the credit of the President of the United States, yesterday in the meetings with the Chinese, he made clear his determination that the persistent imbalance must be corrected. And it's interesting, the headline on the New York Times story is, with warning, Obama presses China on currency. And I think we are now at a new period. This must be addressed. And I think we would welcome true bipartisan support. So, Mr. Camp, I welcome your statement. Mr. Rangel, you wanted?
Yes, I listened to the ranking member, and I have a statement in my hand, and I think on the full committee recognizes, while there may not be unanimity in terms of approaching this challenge that we face with the People's Republic of China, that we're making it abundantly clear that as a committee we would not tolerate the unfair practices that they have had, and that we should send a message that, notwithstanding the differences, your statement makes it abundantly clear that to the President, as well as to other countries that have been unfair, that we stand together on this issue. And I just want to publicly thank Mr. Camp and you, Mr. Chairman, for the degree of unanimity that we do have. Thank you.
Good, and I hope we'll carry forth with this. The President said yesterday, if the Chinese don't take actions, we have other means of protecting U.S. interests, and what we are doing at an important moment is providing one of these means. And so with this, we'll turn to the legislation. The committee will now consider H.R. 2378, the Currency Reform for Fair Trade Act. Without objection, the bill is considered as read and open for amendment at any point. I hear no objection. As is customary, the Chair offers an amendment in the nature of a substitute, and without objection, the amendment is considered as read. The Chair recognizes that we have Jason Kearns, Trade Counsel from our Subcommittee on Trade, here with us. Welcome, Mr. Kearns, and we welcome your family. And so I'll now ask him to briefly go through the bill and the Chairman's amendments, and then answer any questions from our members. Mr. Kearns, your turn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Camp. Before describing the substance of the bill, I will briefly describe how the countervailing duty law works and the immediate events giving rise to this legislation, specifically recent decisions by the Department of Commerce not to investigate whether currency undervaluation constitutes a countervailable subsidy. First, how the law works. Tariffs can be imposed on imports benefiting from certain subsidies if those subsidized imports materially injure a U.S. industry. The amount of the duty is calculated to offset the amount of the subsidy. A subsidy is a countervailable subsidy, for example, where a government makes a financial contribution, a benefit is thereby conferred, and that subsidy is contingent upon export performance, an export subsidy. Commerce recently refused to investigate whether currency manipulation is a countervailable export subsidy for the sole reason that any currency subsidy given for the exportation of merchandise is also given to several other groups, such as U.S. tourists in China. This determination is inconsistent with WTO rulings in two important respects. First, the WTO agreements make clear that all of the facts need to be considered. According to the appellate body, quote, there can be no general rule as to what facts or what kinds of facts must be taken into account. Second, the WTO has made clear in several rulings that a subsidy can be considered an export subsidy, even if that subsidy is available in circumstances that do not involve export. The Foreign Sales Corporation FISC dispute is one such case. In the words of the appellate body in that case, our conclusion that a measure grants subsidies that are export contingent in one set of circumstances is not affected by the fact that the subsidy can also be obtained in a second set of circumstances. This, of course, is the exact opposite of what Commerce decided in the recent cases before it. Let me now turn briefly to the revised bill. Consistent with WTO rules, the revised bill would override existing Commerce practice by precluding Commerce from dismissing a claim for the sole reason that the subsidy is available in circumstances not involving export. Instead, Commerce will be required to consider all facts before it. The bill also includes two other substantive provisions. First, the bill provides direction in how to calculate whether a benefit exists, using models developed by the IMF. Second, the revised bill also ensures that duties will only be imposed if the currency is fundamentally undervalued. That requires four findings: large-scale government intervention in the markets, undervaluation of at least 5%, a significant and persistent global current account surplus by the exporting country, and excessive foreign asset reserves. That concludes my summary of the bill. I would be happy to answer any questions.
We'll go down the line. I guess Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the effort by Chairman Levin to listen to the concerns of Ranking Member Camp, address the original bill's most troubling provisions, which could damage our efforts to sell American and compete successfully in the growing China market. But I oppose this bill. My view is that on balance, the promises this bill makes to reduce the trade deficit with China and create U.S. jobs will go largely unrealized. This will not be effective in convincing China to change its exchange rate practices and allow significant appreciation of the RMB. Now, I'm convinced that when the priority is creating American jobs, a focus on tearing down more substantive barriers to U.S. access to China's consumers, like protecting U.S. intellectual property rights, directed lending, and artificial barriers to farm products, would benefit thousands of more American workers than a focus on China currency alone. I'm also, Mr. Chairman, suspicious that after 4 years of controlling Congress, Democrats are now rushing this bill to the House floor in the final weeks ahead of the election. Playing politics with an issue this serious is risky for American workers. And Mr. Kearns, I'd like to ask you about what this bill lacks. Is there any provision in this bill that would address the major barrier in technology dealing with indigenous innovation?
No, sir. Not directly.
Is there any provision in this bill dealing with China's non-tariff barriers that block U.S. ag exports?
Other than in terms of the currency undervaluation affecting them, no.
Is there anything provision that deals with China's failure to protect our intellectual property rights?
No, it's currency specific.
Anything dealing with barriers to banking and life insurance, electronic payments, or express delivery, those aren't included either?
No, other than the fact that currency undervaluation affects some of those things.
Directed lending, which has been a major issue, restricting rare earth commodities, again raised by major U.S. companies as a roadblock, those are absent as well.
That's right.
Thank you. One, I appreciate your, as a key staff on this committee, you've been very accessible to us in discussions. I appreciate that very much. But, Chairman, I still go back to the point that I don't think this will be effective, and I wonder why it's coming to a markup today. We've had 4 years to deal with this issue. Nothing's been done. No markup has been held, and the author of this bill a week ago said that basically this would be tremendously helpful, his quote, tremendously helpful to firing up the Democrats' political base, that this was a political issue, not a policy issue. And I think given our complex relationship with China, now is not the time to be risking our jobs for any type of political gain. Why so late? Why now?
Well, you've asked me, and I'll tell you. This issue has been building and building. Unlike the previous administration, this president raised this issue very dramatically at the G20 meeting. China made a commitment that it was going to have a flexible structure. In the months since then, it has failed to implement that policy. So here we are today, a few months, several months after the Chinese said they would adopt a flexible approach, and they haven't. We're not here for political reasons. We're here because a failure of the Chinese to commit, to carry out a commitment. And those who say no, essentially, are going to be looking the other way in terms of fulfillment of a commitment by the Chinese. This isn't policy. It's good policy.
If this is good
It's not-
policy, why is, I assume then, the White House is backing this bill?
The answer is just in the President's statement, and I will read it again because it's very clear. If the Chinese do not take action, the U.S. has other means. And this is an important moment in this committee because we essentially are putting together a WTO consistent other means.
But
now,
the White
let me
House,
just add.
just to be clear, though, the White House.
Let me just keep my time.
And the job creators, actually, I believe it is still my time, but
No,
the
you
White
asked
House
me,
and
no.
the job creators are not supporting this bill. American companies that export and sell our American products built by American workers have not endorsed it.
It depends. I think you had your time. You asked me a question. I was answering it on my own time. Look, no one can deny this has an impact on American jobs. Dr. Berkston's estimate is 500,000, and he comes with a very credible background. There are other experts who estimate it much more so. Now, you talk about 4 years. 2 of those years, we had a different president.
But the same Congress.
Yeah, but a different president.
But the same Congress.
Well, we're acting. We're acting, sir. And if anything's going to make it political, it will be a tax on this that it's political. Because essentially, it's saying to the Chinese, you made on a multilateral basis a commitment which you're not carrying out. And this bill is a responsible WTO consistent approach as essentially said by the ranking member. And let me finish.
I will,
Now,
yes, sir.
a petition was filed by the steelworkers on the very issues that you mentioned, including innovation, and also in terms of IPR. This administration has taken steps, filed complaints against the Chinese on some of these issues. It has a petition that was endorsed for action by 140 or so members of this Congress, urging the administration to accept the petition. And there was, I think, only one Republican who signed that letter. But I don't want to get into today this kind of a political argument. We have in front of us a specific piece of legislation that emanates from the hearings held by this committee. We held hearings. The testimony was overwhelmingly clear that this had to change, that it was impacting American workers, it was impacting American businesses, and it was impacting American jobs. No one is saying this is the only factor. It is a significant factor. And to look the other way and say, because it doesn't consider all, we'll vote so we consider none, is not, in my judgment, a tenable position.
It is hard. Let me be clear. One, I respect your leadership. I respect you and appreciate you working with our ranking member who's raised real concerns, and you have worked to address them. Thank you. Two, this is a bipartisan issue. We all agree.
We'll be bipartisan today. Don't raise partisan issues.
It is hard when the author of the bill says this should move forward, so it will be helpful to rally our political base. But I'll conclude with this.
Mr. Chairman.
Okay,
I
look,
think, let me make this one point.
Your time is up.
Let me make a point. I think members should vote their district's economic relationship with China. We will have people on both sides of the aisle who look at their jobs and their makeup and support or oppose this bill. And I respect that. We should. I just am concerned about risking our jobs for political purposes.
I'm not sure whose time it is. Mr. Brady, this is a local and a national issue. This is a national issue. Period.
I seek to be recognized, Mr. Chairman.
You're next, Mr. Rangel.
You know,
And we'll limit everybody to 5 minutes. I'm not sure whose 15 minutes that was, Mr. Brady. Okay.
I think the record is clear about my support for Mr. Brady, especially as it relates to his concern about American trade. And I'm really amazed and set back that he would say that we as a committee are getting involved in this issue now because of politics. It seems to me when someone is out of their job, lost their home, lost their self-respect, that we don't check and ask them, Mr. Brady, whether Republican or whether they're Democrats. And the whole idea that we're going into an election, I really don't think that there's anything that we could do that the minority would not be able to say it's political. But it is abundantly clear that this is not the magic bullet that's going to cure the pain that Americans are suffering because of lack of employment. But when you clearly find the Alliance for American Manufacturing, when you find from A to B hundreds of American companies that encourage us to give them the incentives to build in the USA, to be able to create the jobs, and to have the pride that America used to enjoy instead of just cheaper goods, I had really hoped that at least we could pause on this, notwithstanding the election, and say, this is a positive thing in the right direction, and we're sending a message to Communist China that we will not tolerate unfairness in terms of trade, notwithstanding the fact that that we are the beneficiary of their cheap slave labor. So you complimented staff, and I asked staff, What is the connection between this bill and jobs? What has been the reaction to American manufacturers as it relates to this thing that we're trying to do? And I yield to Mr. Kearns.
Well, Mr. Ringel, I guess it would say what Chairman Levin said. First of all, Fred Bergson has estimated that this will increase employment by 500,000. Paul Krugman has estimated a higher number, 1.4 to 1.
Will these jobs be just for Democrats?
Would Mr. Rangel yield? Would Mr. Rangel yield?
I yield to the ranking member.
I would just say that I appreciate that we have staff from the committee here testifying. Obviously, on our side, we would prefer an administration witness, but I really think this is outside the expertise and purview of the staff to estimate the job creation that this bill might
I'm
result
not
in.
asking him,
And so
Mr. Camp, to give me his impression about what is going to happen as a result of the passage of this bill. What I am asking is that have outside people come and communicate it to him as to what the impact is going to be. And whether that's positive or negative, these are the things that we rely on before we make decisions. That's why lobbyists cannot just all be demonized. They have different problems. I respect what American manufacturers would want, to hire more people and to manufacture. So I'm not asking him what's going to happen. I'm asking, did people come to you in support of the bill and against the bill? And the final determination is, what is the attitude of the American
let me
if I might
suggest
just say that,
let me suggest this. It was Mr. Rangel's time. Let me suggest this. I think Mr. Kearns has answered. I'd like to ask if there are members, then we'll have time for discussion. I hope not endless discussion.
Mr. Chairman?
I certainly hope Mr. Brady would tell me how the heck I can get time.
Okay, Mr. Neal will be recognized.
well, and I would just say, if we could keep the discussion to the technical guidance that the committee staff offer this committee, I would appreciate that.
I yield to Mr. Camp in view of his impartial statement to this bill.
All right, let me suggest this. Let's ask Mr. Kearns some questions about the bill, okay? And then there'll be time for anybody to make a statement before we hopefully expeditiously come to a vote. So next in terms of question is Mr. Neal.
Well, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And
I know you'll put it in
succinctly.
terms of a technical question.
I will. Mr. Chairman, I want to defend the timing of this legislation as you've proposed it and the committee has offered it. Yesterday, the United Nations opened. There was a courtesy that President Obama extended to the Chinese Premier, Wen Jiabao, in an opportunity to convince him of the merit of the argument and an acknowledgement, at least on the Chinese side, that something needs to be done, albeit very slowly. There have been hearings that have taken place in this committee on this very issue. The Secretary of the Treasury appeared as recently as last week to acknowledge that many of the efforts that they've made and from an administrative capacity have not prevailed. To remind our friends on the other side that 44 members of the Republican conference have signed this legislation. That's a very important consideration. And I think that what we're suggesting here today is a market-based solution to sovereign capitalism. I mean, the Chinese practice sovereign capitalism. The response here has been, since Nick Brady was Secretary of the Treasury, to let the Secretary of the Treasury negotiate privately on this issue. So the timing here should not be called into consideration. We should mark it instead based upon the fact that there are 44 members on the Republican side and overwhelming support on our side for a response.
All right. Now, we're going to go down the line. I think we've had kind of an even division of comments unrelated to the technical aspects of the bill. Mr. Kearns is here to discuss them. So I'm going to insist now that we go down the row. Whoever wants to ask a question about the bill technically. Mr. Bustani. Oh, well, you want to ask a question, Mr. Herger, on the bill? Okay. He has more seniority. Someday you'll be further up, I think. I hope not on this side, but that's Mr. Herger, you have a question.
Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you, and I want to join with our side in thanking you for this markup. This is very important. As you can tell, that there's a tremendous amount of concern among all of us. We're in the worst economic downturn in many decades. We are all experiencing people that are out of work. So obviously, this issue is important, and it gets up a little bit of ire, but it's not because we're not in support in general of the direction that we're going on this legislation. And I would like to ask, with this in mind, knowing that there's other concerns here, we do agree on this, that China's currency is undervalued. However, I think the point being made on our side is that an undervalued RBM is only one factor affecting the current trade imbalance with China, and it's just one of a multitude of problems that China must address. In fact, we have heard from witnesses that the most pressing needs of U.S. businesses and workers when it comes to China are increased market access and greater protection of intellectual property rights. There are significant barriers to U.S. exports to China, such as the indigenous innovation policy or sanitary and phytosanitary barriers that this legislation does not address. Mr. Kearns, could you tell me, how does this legislation create more market access for U.S. goods and services if these trade barriers remain in place?
All right, Mr. Kearns, answer that, if you would, briefly. It's really not a question relating to the bill in any technical sense, I don't think. But go ahead, if you would answer it briefly.
The bill is limited to the application of countervailing duties on imports that are related to undervalued currencies.
All right. Mr. Herger, that's the answer to your question. Now, we're going to have time for people to make statements, though I hope it will be somewhat succinct. Are there other technical questions? Mr. Cantor, can you wait if you don't have a technical question?
Mr. Chairman, I have a just technical question.
Okay.
Yes. Mr. Chairman, thank you.
I'm all ears.
Thank you very much. I just want to hear from Mr. Kearns about the movement of this bill from its, I guess, original form with the Ryan of Ohio bill and the concerns that some of us had about its noncompliance with the WTO and how this version itself is on its face moving towards where some could say it is on its face compliant.
Okay.
And then potentially, Mr. Chairman, the sense of if the Commerce Department acted, what it could do that would, in a way that would not prompt a suit against us for noncompliance.
Okay, I think the second isn't a technical question. We can't stop someone from filing a suit. My point was on your second issue that if China disagreed, they should follow the WTO rules and file a suit and not do something inconsistent in terms of so-called retaliation. But let Mr. Kearns, I do think he covered that in his original statement, but if you can succinctly, it's a legitimate issue, to discuss how this amendment is shaped. Mr. Kearns?
Mr. Cantor, I think the main difference from the original bill to this bill on that issue is that the original bill essentially deemed that currency undervaluation constitutes an export subsidy, and this version of the bill simply removes the one barrier that commerce found in its way, and we think does so in a WTO-consistent manner.
Okay. Other technical questions only. Mr. Bustani.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am going to honor that request to keep it to technical questions. Insofar as we're amending the 1930 Tariff Act, under Section 2 on page 3, subsection C. It says, during an 18-month period, the country has experienced significant and persistent global current account surpluses. I'm a little troubled by the word significant, and what does that mean? Does it have a quantitative meaning as currently defined in law, or are we leaving this totally to the discretion of the Department of Commerce?
There's no definition of the term, and so I think it would be up to the Department of Commerce to interpret it.
So I would ask an open question: should that be something this committee should have considered by putting some parameters there? I know we do want to leave some flexibility with Commerce, but this seems overly broad to me.
But Mr. Bustani, that's true of all countervailing duty cases. And so I think you would have to take a look at the entire range of cases that come before Commerce and think about a dramatic change in the legislation. So essentially that kind of judgment resides in Commerce as part of our countervailing duty subsidy structure. Isn't that correct, Mr. Kearns?
That's correct. One example would be material injury. Material has almost no real definition in the statute.
But I think under all administrations, there's been an ability to work with that. This changes the present practices, but in a different way.
I understand. A second question, Mr. Chairman, for Mr. Kearns. Also on page 5, likewise under Section 2, it's subsection B, where it references other international organizations in the absence of IMF data. Again, I'm a little concerned about the overly broad statement there. Other international organizations is very broad, and should this committee have considered placing some parameters and specifications as to which might be legitimate international organizations under consideration? I recognize that Commerce and respect their expertise, but at the same time, I believe this committee has a duty to exercise its prerogatives and obligations as well, and feel that we probably should specify some parameters.
Mr. Kearns?
The term is not defined in the bill.
Other aspects of the statute give Commerce wide discretion to use any public data.
Okay.
So this is just left overly broad in terms of international organizations. So it could be labor organizations, it could be anything that's up to the prerogative of whoever's making that determination at Commerce.
My understanding is that the IMF has the information that is needed, and so I'm not sure if we'll ever get to this situation. In terms of organizations such as labor organizations, I'm not sure that they do. The organization that comes immediately to mind after the IMF would probably be the World Bank.
Right, World Bank and international settlements and so forth. But that's why I wondered why maybe we should have specified that statutorily as opposed to leaving it overly broad.
It's true of subsidies generally. Mr. Bustani.
Mr. Chairman, maybe this is something we can work through before this were to go to the floor if we get that far.
Well, we can look at that, and perhaps we can look at it after it goes to the floor. Because you're talking about general provisions in our countervailing duty subsidy statute. And I think we need to be careful before we begin to amend that overall structure. We'd have to do so very carefully and ask ourselves whether or not it hasn't worked. And the legislation here specifically refers to IMF.
Well, it does, but it also says if the IMF cannot provide the data, then the fallback is on other international organizations. And
because I think we would want some provision to be able to do so. But also I think these are technical issues. We very much want to rely on the expertise of the Commerce Department and to try to insulate this from unnecessary impacts outside of the expertise of our Commerce Department. So let's talk about this.
I have concerns about that part and for that reason, I'm inclined to oppose the legislation in its current form.
But as I mentioned to you yesterday, I hope you'll vote for it.
If you'll work with me on this particular issue.
At some point, we will take that up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right. Are there other technical questions? If not, so that we can move along, let me ask, and then we'll have general discussion to the extent we want it. Are there any amendments to this legislation? Mr. Camp has an amendment.
Thank you very
Camp's
much.
recognized for 5 minutes. Will it be distributed? Well, you can start. We want to move
Okay,
along.
thank you.
so
Yes, I understand
discuss
you
it
do.
while it's being circulated.
I have an amendment that would require the Comptroller General of the United States to consider the effect of this act on United States manufacturers that are industrial users of imported products. It's important to monitor the real-world impact of legislation, and I welcome that Section 3 of the substitute requires GAO to report on the effect of this act on manufacturers receiving relief under the bill. But I'm concerned that the report will not reflect the full effect on all aspects of the American economy and American manufacturing, because it only focuses on one type of manufacturer, manufacturers that compete against imports. That's why I'm proposing this amendment. It would require GAO to report on all American manufacturers impacted by the bill. And this amendment is based on the premise that we should not be treating one type of manufacturer differently than any other. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Camp. Let me indicate my opposition and why. And I hate to use auto parts only. It would apply otherwise. But when there's consideration of subsidies and countervailing duties, when there's consideration of other issues, for example, IPR, fake auto parts, and action that should be taken in response, we don't say to ourselves, well, the auto parts that are coming in that are fake auto parts are cheaper than the auto parts made in the United States, and therefore there should be no action taken because the consumer is better off in the end having a product with counterfeited goods in it. So I think before we go down this road, we had better carefully consider its impact, not only as to currency, but as to other parts of our code, other parts of our statute. This kind of an issue has been raised before. I really think we don't want to start down a slippery slope, putting it into this provision regarding currency without some very serious thought of its implications. What is true of auto parts is true of all electronic goods, everything that can come in from China, and I think we don't want to open this door unless we were very, very clear as to its potential impact. Is there other comment? If not, I'll call for a vote.
Mr. Chairman.
Yes, Mr. Brady?
Staying within my time. Why would we, on a study of this importance, why would we impose a gag order on the administration to ignore the impact it has on U.S. manufacturing companies and U.S. workers who use products from other countries to compete and win successfully around the world? Why are some manufacturing jobs less important than other manufacturing jobs? Mr. Camp's amendment simply says, let's look at the impact on all U.S. manufacturers of these cases, these specific cases. I think, trying to view only one portion of our economy and jobs versus looking at the real impact, this administration and this Congress, before making substantial moves, should actually understand what it does to hurt or help U.S. workers and their jobs. That's what Mr. Camp's amendment does. Let's not take a partial or a biased view. Let's take a look at the entire impact of these cases. I think this amendment is very appropriate in a day we need U.S. manufacturing jobs, all U.S. manufacturing jobs, and I would urge its acceptance. I think this is a very bipartisan amendment. If you want to look at, if all manufacturing jobs in America matter, there should be bipartisan support for this amendment.
I would like to close on it.
All right, any other comment? If not, Mr. Camp, do you want to close?
Yeah, I'll just close very briefly on the amendment, and just to say that this really doesn't affect the issue of downstream users. This is really only expanding the reporting requirement so that Commerce has complete information. I think one of the things that many of us on both sides have said that we haven't had enough information at these hearings. This would help do that. It really only adds a second paragraph, does not change the initial language in the GAO report, but would simply say that this would apply to industrial users of imported products simply in a reporting aspect to make sure that the department has the best information possible and most complete information possible. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll vote. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
All those opposed? No, no. The nays have it. Are there further amendments? If there are no further amendments, I've been handed a document that would call for a final vote. But is this acceptable that we proceed? Yes, all right. The question is on the amendment in the nature of a substitute. All those in favor say aye. All those opposed? No. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. The amendment is agreed to. The chair will be in receipt of a motion. Mr. Stark?
Mr. Rangel will respond.
Mr. Rangel.
Mr. Chairman, I move that H.R. 2378 as amended be reported favorably to the House, and Mr. Stark joins with me in that request.
All right. The question is on the motion of Mr. Rangel on behalf of himself. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
That's hard.
All those opposed, nay. No. The ayes have it, and the motion is agreed to. All members will have 2 days to file any additional views, and without objection, the staff is authorized to make any technical corrections. The committee now stands adjourned.
Good job. Dave, this is really great.